Something is cutting through the South China Sea right now. Something enormous. Something that does not move at this speed unless the people giving the orders have already decided that time is running out. The USS Tripoli, an 844-foot amphibious assault ship displacing more than 45,000 tons, is pushing through the water at speeds that have surprised even the most experienced naval analysts watching from the outside. It is flanked on both sides by two Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers. Satellite imagery captured by the European Space Agency recorded the full formation last weekend near Vietnam's Phu Yen province, positioned midway between Vietnam and the Philippine island of Mindoro. The wakes trailing behind these vessels are unusually wide and deep. That is exactly what happens when a warship of this particular size is ordered to stop its standard cruising pace and start sprinting with full urgency toward a destination. Open source naval analyst M.T. Anderson tracked the movement of this formation in real time across the South China Sea. His assessment was direct and blunt. He wrote that these vessels are moving with unmistakable purpose, carrying with them a major integrated air and missile defense umbrella as they sprint toward the theater. He described it as a heavily protected offensive posture. Not a patrol, not a routine presence mission, a sprint toward a region where war is already underway. The question you need to sit with right now is not simply what the USS Tripoli is as a ship. The question is what the United States government has decided it needs to do and why it has concluded at this precise moment in this precise week that it must pull one of its most powerful mobile military platforms out of the Pacific and aim it directly at the most dangerous and economically critical waterway on the surface of the Earth. To understand that decision, you first need to understand what has taken place at the Strait of Hormuz over the past 17 days. And once you understand what has happened there, you will understand why every financial market on the planet is watching that 21-mile channel of water with something that resembles terror in the calculations of their analysts and risk managers. On February 28th of 2026, the United States and Israel jointly launched a coordinated air campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran. The operation was designated Epic Fury. It targeted Iranian military infrastructure across multiple locations, nuclear facilities that had been under international scrutiny for years, and Iranian leadership at the highest levels of the regime. Among those killed in the opening hours of the campaign was Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Within hours of his death, the world changed in ways that were not metaphorical, not symbolic, but literal, physical, and measurable in ways that are now costing ordinary working people across Asia, Europe, and the Americas real money on a daily basis, without those people having had any voice in the decisions that caused it. Iran's response was not an attack against a military installation. Iran's response was to close a door that the entire global economy walks through every single day. On March the 2nd, a senior commander within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps made an announcement that sent shockwaves through oil markets, through maritime insurance companies, and through the finance ministries of 30 different nations simultaneously. He said with the directness of someone who meant every word that the strait is closed and that any vessel attempting to pass through the waterway will be set ablaze. He was not delivering a rhetorical threat. He was issuing operational instructions that his forces were already prepared to enforce. Within 48 hours of that announcement, tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, which had averaged 24 vessels transiting per day under normal conditions, collapsed to just 4 ships. 3 of those 4 were Iranian flagged. The remaining commercial shipping world, the tankers carrying crude oil that powers factories in South Korea, that feeds refineries in India, that keeps power, plants running in Japan, and that sustains supply chains across Southeast Asia, came to a complete halt. Over 150 ships dropped anchor on both sides of the strait, sitting idle and waiting for an all-clear signal that has not come and shows no signs of arriving. If you are watching this, and you are not yet subscribed to Backdoor Economics, now is the moment to do it. Hit that subscribe button right now. We go behind the headlines and show you what the economic machine actually looks like when it is under pressure. Subscribe to Backdoor Economics. Here's the single number that explains everything, including why the USS Tripoli is currently sprinting across the South China Sea at a pace that leaves unusually large wakes in its trail. 20%. 20% of the world's daily oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Not some portion of it, not a fraction that can be rerouted without consequence. 20% every single day in an uninterrupted flow that the entire architecture of the modern global economy was built to depend upon. When that flow stops, the entire global energy system begins operating on borrowed time and emergency reserves that were never designed to serve as permanent replacements. The International Energy Agency stated the situation plainly in its March 26th market report. It described the war in the Middle East as creating the largest supply disruption in the recorded history of the global oil market. Crude and oil product flows through the strait have fallen from approximately 20 million barrels per day before the war began to what the IEA carefully called a trickle. Gulf countries have already cut total oil production by at least 10 million barrels per day. Global oil supply is projected to fall by 8 million barrels in March alone. Brent crude, which had been trading at around $83 per barrel before February 28th, surged toward $120 within days of the Strait's closure. It has since settled at approximately $113 as emergency strategic reserves were released into the market. But the IEA has been explicit in its public statements that those reserves represent a temporary measure against a structural problem, not a solution to it. The world's combined emergency oil stockpiles can cover roughly 20 days of normal Hormuz flow. After those 20 days are consumed, every available economic scenario gets substantially worse. Goldman Sachs built a detailed model of what comes next if this situation does not resolve itself quickly. In their base case, where Brent crude averages $98 through March and April, they have already raised their 2026 inflation forecast for the United States by 0.8 percentage points and have trimmed their GDP growth estimate accordingly. In a more severe scenario, with oil averaging $110 sustained over 2 months, they raised the probability of a full U.S. recession by 5 percentage points. That is not a rounding error. That is a significant structural shift in the risk landscape for the world's largest economy. Oxford Economics went further in its stress modeling. They constructed a scenario around $140 oil sustained for 2 months and concluded that it would be sufficient to push the Eurozone, the United Kingdom, and Japan into full economic contraction. They used the phrase economic standstill specifically to describe what that scenario would produce inside the United States. These are not the predictions of fringe analysts or provocateurs. These are the baseline stress tests being run right now, in real time, by the largest and most respected financial institutions on Earth, as the USS Tripoli races westward across the South China Sea toward the Persian Gulf. And it is not only oil that moves through the Strait of Hormuz. The strait carries liquefied natural gas. It carries aluminum, steel, and fertilizer. 30% of Europe's jet fuel either originates from or transits through that 21-mile channel. 20% of global LNG supplies move through that same passage. Qatar declared force majeure on its gas contracts on March 4th. Qatar's energy minister warned publicly, and without reservation, that if this conflict continues, other Gulf producers may be forced to halt their exports entirely. He did not soften his language. He said this will bring down economies of the world. That is not a regional warning. That is a global one. Countries across Asia are already experiencing the opening stage of this disruption in ways that are showing up in government announcements and daily life. Vietnam has oil, reserves estimated to last fewer than 20 days under normal consumption. Pakistan and Indonesia have approximately the same window of reserve coverage. Around 80% of all Asian oil imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz at some point in their transit. China, which imports roughly 40% of its oil from Middle Eastern suppliers, had the strategic foresight to build up crude stockpiles before the conflict began. But even China cannot run indefinitely on stored oil. And Iran, which has quietly continued allowing Chinese-flagged vessels limited passage through the strait, cannot sustain that diplomatic exception without accumulating political cost from the other parties to the conflict. Japan's refiners, who source approximately 95% of their crude oil from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, and who receive roughly 70% of that supply through the Strait of Hormuz, have already formally asked their government to authorize the release of emergency stockpiles. Schools have been closed in multiple Asian countries in response to energy conservation directives. Workers have been instructed to stay home. Governments from Southeast Asia to South Asia are telling their citizens to adopt active fuel-saving measures in anticipation of what the coming weeks will bring. This is the world into which the USS Tripoli is now sailing at full speed. Now let us talk precisely about what the USS Tripoli actually is, because most people who have heard its name mentioned in the past 72 hours have no real understanding of what this machine is capable of doing. It is not a standard aircraft carrier. It is something more architecturally complex and in some specific ways more operationally dangerous in the precise environment of a strait closure and contested coastal warfare. The USS Tripoli is an America-class amphibious assault ship. It measures 844 feet from bow to stern. It displaces more than 45,000 tons fully loaded. It can carry more than 700 Marines, along with their complete complement of equipment and vehicles. It operates on F-35B Lightning II stealth jets, the short takeoff and vertical landing variant of the most advanced stealth fighter aircraft currently in the U.S. military arsenal, along with MV-22 Osprey tiltrotor aircraft and a full fleet of attack and support helicopters, designed for a range of combat and logistics missions. This combination of aviation assets, marine infantry, and sustained deep-water mobility is precisely why military analysts frequently describe the Tripoli as a lightning carrier. It does not require a fixed runway. It does not require a port facility. It can project substantial military force directly from open water onto a contested coastline, or provide comprehensive air defense cover for a maritime corridor that is currently under active threat. Its two escort vessels are not support ships in any passive sense. The Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers traveling in formation with the Tripoli carry the standard missile series for layered air and ballistic missile defense systems designed specifically to intercept the kinds of ballistic missiles and drone swarms that Iran has been deploying throughout this conflict. They also carry Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of striking fixed targets deep inside sovereign territory. The entire formation, the Tripoli plus its twin destroyer escort, is exactly what M.T. Anderson assessed it to be. A package designed simultaneously to defend and to strike. Not one capability or the other, both at the same time. This makes the Tripoli the fourth major U.S. naval asset now converging on the Gulf region. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was already positioned in theater when this conflict began. The USS Gerald R. Ford was positioned to apply pressure on Iran from the north. Now the Tripoli is racing in from the Pacific. The Pentagon has officially confirmed the deployment, acknowledging that the ship will deliver the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, roughly 2,200 Marines and sailors normally based in Okinawa, Japan, into the Middle East theater. Military officials have been deliberate in the language they have chosen to describe the mission. The words they keep using in their official statements are raids on Iranian territory, securing the Strait of Hormuz, and rapid response combat operations. These are not the phrases of a peacekeeping mission. These are the precise terms used when planners are preparing for something that has not yet happened, but that their analysis tells them is coming. Here is the strategic logic that the Pentagon is operating under as it directs the Tripoli toward the Gulf at maximum speed. Iran has demonstrated over the course of 17 days that it can effectively close the strait without relying primarily on its surface navy. The U.S. military has already destroyed a substantial portion of Iran's conventional naval fleet, but the strait remains closed. Iran can continue to threaten and attack commercial shipping through a combination of coastal missile batteries positioned along its extensive Persian Gulf shoreline, drone swarms launched from those same coastal positions, and naval mines placed in the navigable channel. According to a media report from March 9th, Iran has already laid fewer than 10 mines inside the strait. President Trump responded on social media with a public warning that if Iran did not remove those mines, the military consequences to Iran would be at a level never seen before in the history of that country. The USS Tripoli changes the strategic calculation in one very specific and consequential way. An amphibious assault ship carrying Marine infantry and F-35B stealth jets gives the United States the operational ability to conduct what military planners call littoral operations, meaning close-in combat operations along contested coastlines, in precisely the kind of restricted coastal environment where Iran's missile and drone infrastructure is physically located. F-35B jets launching from the Tripoli's deck can reach Iranian coastal targets faster and with greater stealth capability than assets operating from carrier strike groups positioned further out in the deeper waters of the Arabian Sea. Marines aboard the ship can be staged for direct raids on Iranian coastal infrastructure, targeting the missile batteries, the drone launch and control sites, and the mine-laying operations in ways that carrier-based air power, operating from greater distances, simply cannot accomplish with the same speed and precision. The Tripoli's arrival in theater is simultaneously a military instrument and a geopolitical statement. It is the United States signaling to Iran, clearly and physically, that the response will not be limited to bombing facilities from altitude. The capability to dismantle those facilities from the coastline is now on its way. But there is another layer beneath this story that mainstream coverage has largely failed to examine with the depth it deserves. The deployment of the Tripoli has exposed a fracture inside the Western alliance that is just as strategically significant as anything currently happening inside the Strait of Hormuz itself. When the Trump administration reached out to its traditional partners and allies and asked them to send warships to join the American naval formation, the responses it received were not what it had anticipated or had perhaps assumed would be forthcoming. Germany said no. Luxembourg's foreign minister called Trump's demand blackmail and reminded the alliance publicly that NATO's collective defense clause requires member states to have been directly attacked before it can be legally invoked, and stated plainly that none of them had been directly attacked. Japan declined to participate. Australia declined. The United Kingdom has not made any firm commitment. Germany's foreign minister asked publicly whether Germany would become an active participant in this conflict, and then answered his own question directly. No, he said, we will not participate. We want to participate in negotiations. China, which has more to lose economically from a prolonged Hormuz closure than perhaps any other single nation, is navigating its own carefully calibrated strategic calculation. Iran has continued allowing Chinese-flagged vessels limited passage through the closed strait. Beijing is reportedly weighing the option of allowing cargoes traded in Chinese yuan to transit the strait under a separate diplomatic arrangement, a move that would directly and fundamentally challenge the US dollar's historical dominance in global energy markets. China has no interest in shooting its way through the Strait of Hormuz alongside the US Navy. It has every interest in positioning itself as the indispensable regional power that keeps energy flowing to Asia while Washington manages a crisis that Washington itself initiated. The alliance fracture is not a side story running parallel to the main event. It is the story beneath the story. The USS Tripoli is racing toward the Persian Gulf in significant part because Trump found himself standing largely alone when he called on his partners to share the military burden. Now consider the full economic picture that has assembled itself in just 17 days. Oil prices above $100, LNG supply chains under severe and worsening pressure, Qatar declaring force majeure on its gas export contracts, war risk insurance premiums making commercial shipping through the strait economically unviable for most carriers, Asian governments actively instructing citizens to conserve fuel now, Goldman Sachs raising recession probability estimates, the IEA formally declaring this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, Oxford Economics constructing models in which $140 oil pushes multiple G7 economies into full economic contraction. And the underlying arithmetic that emergency oil reserve releases, the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve held 415 million barrels as of mid-February, cannot replace what the strait normally moves. At normal Hormuz traffic levels of 20 million barrels per day, the entire U.S. emergency reserve would cover approximately 20 days of disrupted flow, even if every major consuming nation simultaneously released its reserves in a coordinated response. The math does not work for a conflict that Trump himself has suggested could last a month or longer. Saudi Arabia has been redirecting portions of its crude exports through the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea, routing oil through the east-west crude oil pipeline, specifically to bypass the closed strait. The UAE has been diverting oil through the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline to the port of Fujairah on the Arabian Sea coast. But these two pipelines combined have a capacity deficit of approximately 12 million barrels per day compared to normal Hormuz transit volumes. And the Red Sea route carries its own embedded risk. The Houthis, who spent most of the past year launching drone and missile attacks against commercial shipping in that corridor, remain active and capable. The world's alternative routes are overwhelmed. The world's emergency reserves are finite and diminishing. The world's alliances are fracturing under the pressure of disagreement about who started the situation and who bears responsibility for resolving it. What happens when the USS Tripoli arrives will change every scenario currently on the table in ways that no model can fully predict in advance. If the ship's presence, combined with the carrier strike groups already operating in theater, is sufficient to deter Iran from continuing to attack commercial vessels, or sufficient to provide meaningful naval escort coverage for ships attempting to transit the strait, then the economic damage begins to reverse itself. Oil prices fall, supply chains restart, the worst recession scenarios get taken off the financial models, the world exhales. If Iran decides to test the Tripoli's arrival with direct escalation, whether by launching coordinated missile and drone strikes against the naval formation itself, or against critical port infrastructure in the UAE, in Bahrain, or in Qatar, or if it moves to expand the minefield inside the strait, then the conflict enters a phase that none of the current U.S. military deployments were designed to manage without a significant commitment of ground forces that has not been authorized and is not currently on the table. And if the USS Tripoli is ultimately used to support marine raids against Iranian coastal infrastructure, the mission that U.S. military officials have explicitly described as one of its potential operational roles in this theater, then the conflict that began on February 28th with targeted airstrikes against Iranian leadership has taken a step that no American administration since 2003 has been willing to authorize. Boots on the ground. In a nation of 90 million people, in terrain and strategic depth that has historically defied and exhausted every occupying military force that has ever attempted to control it. The satellite image that captured the USS Tripoli and its two destroyer escorts cutting through the South China Sea is not merely a photograph of warships in motion, it is a photograph of a decision. Not just a military decision, though it is certainly that. An economic decision, a geopolitical decision about alignments and alliances, a decision about what kind of world emerges from the Strait of Hormuz when this conflict reaches whatever conclusion it reaches. The IMF has warned in explicit terms that every 10% increase in energy prices in 2026 is expected to raise global inflation by close to half a percentage point. These are not abstract institutional projections. These are the costs being measured, right? Now in grocery bills, in household fuel prices, and in manufacturing costs in countries that had no voice in the decisions made in Washington and Jerusalem. countries that are nonetheless paying the price for those decisions every single day. On February 28th, the world looked different. Today, the USS Tripoli is being tracked transiting the southern South China Sea at 18 knots north of the Rio archipelago, approximately 420 miles from Manila. It is moving with full purpose. It is carrying Marines and stealth jets and Tomahawk armed destroyers, and it is heading toward a 21-mile channel where the entire logic of the global economy is currently being tested by an adversary that has decided, rightly or wrongly, that it has nothing remaining to lose by testing that logic to its breaking point. Whether the Tripoli's arrival reopens that channel, escalates the confrontation into its next phase, or produces a negotiated off-ramp that no one has yet publicly announced, that is the question on which the financial future of billions of ordinary people now depends. The world does not run on good intentions. It runs on oil, and right now the oil is not moving. The warships are. There is one final dimension to this story that has not received the attention it deserves in any of the coverage that has followed the Tripoli's deployment. It concerns the specific strategic timing of the United States' decision to pull the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit away from its home station in the Pacific and redirect it toward the Persian Gulf. The 31st MEU is not just any military formation. It is the United States military's designated primary rapid response force for East Asia. Based permanently in Okinawa, Japan, it exists specifically and by design to respond with speed to crises involving the Korean Peninsula, potential conflict scenarios involving Taiwan, or regional humanitarian emergencies that require military coordination. Every serious analyst who covers the Pacific theater has noted the same thing in the commentary of the past week. Moving the 31st MEU to the Middle East creates a temporary but real and measurable gap in American military coverage across the Indo-Pacific region. A gap that China has noticed and is calculating around. A gap that North Korea, which fired 10 ballistic missiles into the sea over the past 48 hours, has also clearly noticed. Kim Jong-un's missile launches were not random. They were a calibrated message delivered at precisely the moment when the world's strategic attention is fixed entirely on the Strait of Hormuz, and when America's Rapid Response Pacific Force is being redirected toward Iran. When the world looks one direction, the window for provocations elsewhere gets wider. The United States is being asked to play a three-dimensional strategic chess match with pieces it does not currently have enough of to cover every board simultaneously. This is the strategic overextension that some of Trump's own senior officials reportedly warned him about before the February 28th strikes were authorized. A source described as close to the administration told Axios that some key officials within the administration were reluctant to move at this pace, or at minimum wanted more time to prepare the conditions for success. The source said Trump ultimately decided that he simply wanted to do it, and that same source delivered an assessment that has been quoted and discussed in financial circles and foreign ministries across the world in the days since. The assessment was that Trump grossly overestimated his ability to topple the Iranian regime short of committing to send in ground troops. That assessment sits beneath every decision being made right now. It explains the Tripoli's rushed deployment. It explains the demand to allies for warships, demands that were rejected by Germany, Japan, Australia, and others. It explains why Trump authorized strikes on Kharg Island, Iran's primary oil export hub, destroying more than 90 military targets there, while simultaneously announcing in the same public statement that he had chosen not to destroy civilian oil infrastructure and warning that he could reconsider that restraint at any moment he chose. Iran's new supreme leader, whose identification and exact location the U.S. Defense Secretary has publicly stated he believes may involve injury and disfigurement from earlier strikes, has continued from wherever he is operating to issue orders and make threats of continued retaliation. His message to the United States has been consistent throughout the 17 days of this conflict. He has stated that attacks on U.S. military assets in the region will continue unless American bases in the area are closed. He has not softened that position in any of his public communications. He has not reached out through any back channels that have been publicly confirmed by either side. Iran's IRGC spokesperson stated publicly that most of Iran's weapons stockpile remains completely untouched by U.S. strikes, and that the missiles deployed so far represent older production from roughly a decade ago. Iran's newer post-2025 production missiles have not yet been introduced into the conflict. Whether that statement reflects a genuine strategic reserve being held back for the right moment, or whether it is a propaganda narrative specifically, designed to sustain deterrence by uncertainty, the uncertainty itself carries strategic power regardless of its factual basis. No military planner in Washington or anywhere else can afford to assume the claim is untrue. The cost of that assumption being wrong is too high. Meanwhile, in financial markets and in agricultural supply chains, the reality of a prolonged strait closure is being priced with increasingly grim precision. Petrochemical plants across Asia have begun cutting production of polymers as liquefied petroleum gas and naphtha supplies from the Gulf have fallen sharply and unpredictably. LPG, which is used for basic cooking and domestic heating across large populations in India and East Africa, is now facing supply shortfalls that governments in those regions did not have contingency plans for at this scale. Food security analysts are watching fertilizer flows through the strait with particular alarm. The Hormuz corridor carries nearly half of the world's urea and sulfur exports. Both of these inputs are essential to agricultural production at a global scale. A sustained fertilizer supply shock does not produce its consequences in energy markets or equity indices. It produces its consequences in food prices, and it does so with a lag of 6 to 12 months, meaning that the farmers who cannot access adequate fertilizer today will produce smaller harvests in the seasons ahead, and the populations that depend on those harvests will pay the price long after any ceasefire is signed and the cameras have moved on. The IEA has already revised its global oil demand forecast for 2026 downward by 210,000 barrels per day. Not because global demand has genuinely declined, but because the physical disruption of this military conflict has made oil unavailable at the quantities and prices at which demand would otherwise be expressed. Global observed inventories currently stand at more than 2.8 billion barrels, the highest level recorded since February of 2021. But those inventories are concentrated overwhelmingly in OECD economies. The nations that need the oil most urgently, the developing economies of Southeast and South Asia, are not the ones currently sitting on those stockpiles. The geography of reserve distribution does not match the geography of need. There is a word that keeps appearing in the serious financial and institutional analysis of this crisis. That word is unprecedented. The IEA has used it. UNCTAD has used it. The financial analysis firm Expat Wealth at Work described the March 2026 Hormuz crisis as a fundamental shift that will reshape global energy markets, supply chains, and investment priorities for decades to come. The strait has been threatened before in its history. It has never been physically closed in this way, for this duration, with this level of military enforcement and commitment from an adversary that has decided it will absorb the cost. Every day the strait remains closed, the bill grows larger, the disruption costs compound. The alternative routing options become more crowded and more expensive. The emergency reserves get smaller, the patience of allies who are already fraying erodes further, and the pressure on the USS Tripoli, and on the decisions its arrival will enable or force, grows more intense with every additional hour. The ship is still moving, it has not yet arrived. The outcome is still unwritten, and anyone who tells you otherwise is projecting certainty onto a situation that is genuinely unresolved. What the satellite imagery tells us with clarity, those unusually large wakes trailing the formation as it drives across the South China Sea, is that the United States government has made a decision, not a defensive decision, not a posture of waiting for conditions to improve. Global energy markets right now. Subscribe to Backdoor Economics if you have not already. We will continue to track this crisis as it develops because the ship has not arrived yet, and the most consequential moments of this story are still ahead. This is Backdoor Economics. Stay informed. Stay ahead.